The text message from my son Marcus arrived at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday, exactly 3 months after I buried his father. Mom, I've been thinking about you. Can we meet for coffee tomorrow? There's so much I want to say. For a moment, I stared at the screen of my phone, wondering if I was dreaming. Marcus, who hadn't spoken to me in 8 years, Marcus, who missed his father's funeral because he claimed to be traveling in Southeast Asia with no phone service, Marcus, who had cut ties with our family when his father refused to bail him out of his third failed business venture. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. At 55, I thought I had experienced every possible betrayal life could offer. I was wrong. My name is Elena Castellano, and until recently, I believed that wealth couldn't buy happiness, but poverty couldn't buy anything. The irony of that belief would soon become the foundation of the most devastating lesson of my life. My husband Vincent had been gone for 3 months when the lawyers finished settling his estate. Vincent Castellano had been a brilliant man, a tech entrepreneur who had built his fortune through a series of strategic investments in emerging technologies during the early days of the internet boom. What I didn't know during our 26 years of marriage was exactly how brilliant he had been. The reading of his will revealed that my quiet, methodical husband had accumulated a fortune of $200 million, nearly all of which he left to me. I had lived modestly our entire marriage, not from necessity, but because Vincent preferred it that way. We lived in a comfortable but unremarkable house in Westchester County, drove reliable but not flashy cars, and took nice but not extravagant vacations. Vincent had always handled our finances, and I trusted him completely. I knew we were comfortable, perhaps even wealthy by most standards, but I had no idea we were rich beyond anything I could have imagined. The revelation came during a meeting with Vincent's estate attorney, Harrison Webb, a distinguished man in his 60s who had been Vincent's friend as well as his legal counsel. Harrison sat across from me in his mahogany-paneled office, his expression grave, as he explained the complexities of Vincent's financial empire. "Elena, I need you to understand something," Harrison said, removing his reading glasses and fixing me with a serious stare. Vincent was extraordinarily careful about protecting his assets and, by extension, protecting you. He structured his investments and holdings in ways that would ensure your security for the rest of your life, regardless of what challenges might arise. The numbers he recited felt surreal. Stock portfolios worth tens of millions of dollars, real estate investments across 3 states, technology patents that generated millions in annual royalties, a private investment fund that had been quietly growing for 2 decades. When Harrison finished explaining the extent of Vincent's wealth, I felt dizzy. "This can't be right," I whispered, staring at the documents spread across his desk. "Vincent never mentioned any of this. We lived so simply." Vincent was a very private man about his financial affairs. He believed that knowledge of extreme wealth changes people, and he wanted to protect you from that burden until it became necessary for you to know. The burden. I hadn't understood what he meant at the time, but I would learn soon enough. Vincent had been right about wealth changing people, but he had underestimated how it would change the people around me. The first few weeks after the reading of the will passed in a blur of financial meetings, investment consultations, and the overwhelming task of learning to manage resources I never knew existed. Harrison guided me through the process with patience and expertise, helping me understand the responsibilities that came with such wealth. I was, in the span of a few documents, transformed from a comfortable widow into one of the wealthiest women in New York State. During those early days, I found myself thinking constantly about Marcus, my son, my only child, who had been estranged from his father and me for 8 long years. The fight that drove him away had been about money, specifically Vincent's refusal to invest in Marcus's third startup after the previous 2 had failed spectacularly, costing Vincent nearly $500,000. Marcus had accused his father of being cheap, of caring more about money than family. Vincent had accused Marcus of being irresponsible and entitled. The argument had escalated into something cruel and personal, with words spoken that could never be taken back. Marcus had stormed out of our house that day, and despite my attempts to mediate, neither he nor Vincent had been willing to make the first move toward reconciliation. The years that followed were punctuated by my secret attempts to maintain some connection with my son. I would send birthday cards that went unacknowledged, Christmas gifts that were never mentioned, and occasional emails that received one-word responses, if they received responses at all. Vincent, hurt by what he saw as Marcus's betrayal and ingratitude, had forbidden me from providing our son with any financial support. If he wants to be independent, let him be independent. When he's ready to apologize for the things he said and show some respect for this family, he knows where to find us. But Marcus never came looking for us, and Vincent's sudden heart attack at 58 meant that reconciliation would never happen between father and son. I had hoped that Vincent's death might bring Marcus home, might shock him into remembering that family was more important than pride. Instead, Marcus had remained absent, offering only a brief, impersonal text message expressing condolences and claiming to be unreachable due to travel. The funeral had been well attended by Vincent's business associates, our neighbors, and my family, but the empty space where my son should have been felt like a physical wound. I had imagined during my darkest moments of grief that Marcus might appear at the last moment, that he might surprise me by walking into the church just as the service began. But he never came, and I buried my husband while grieving not just his death, but the continued absence of our son. So when Marcus's text message arrived 3 months, my first emotion wasn't suspicion or anger, it was relief. Pure, overwhelming relief that my child was finally ready to come home. The timing seemed appropriate. 3 months was long enough for the initial shock of his father's death to settle, long enough for him to process his feelings and realize what he had lost. I responded immediately. "Of course, sweetheart. Tomorrow at 10? Our usual place?" The coffee shop I referred to was a small bistro in downtown Tarrytown, where Marcus and I used to meet during his college years, when he would drive up from Columbia University to do laundry and catch up with his parents. It held happy memories, and I thought it might provide a comfortable, neutral setting for our reunion. His response came quickly. "Perfect. Can't wait to see you, Mom. I've missed you so much." I cried when I read those words. For 8 years, I had wondered if my son still loved me, if he thought about me, if he regretted the chasm that had opened between us. His message seemed to answer all of those questions, and for the first time since Vincent's death, I felt genuinely hopeful about the future. I spent the evening preparing for our meeting with the care of a woman planning the most important date of her life. I chose my outfit carefully, settling on a navy blue dress that Vincent had always complimented, paired with the pearl necklace Marcus had given me for Mother's Day during his senior year of high school. I wanted to look like the mother he remembered, stable and loving, and unchanged by the years of separation. I arrived at the bistro 15 minutes early, too nervous and excited to wait at home any longer. The owner, Mrs. Chen, recognized me immediately and asked about Marcus, whom she remembered from his college visits. I told her he was coming home today, and she smiled broadly, saying she would make sure we had our old table by the window. When Marcus walked through the door at exactly 10 o'clock, I felt my heart leap with joy and break with sadness simultaneously. He looked so much older than I had expected, though I realized with a shock that my baby was now 32 years old. His dark hair, which had always been unruly like his father's, was now styled professionally. He wore an expensive-looking suit and carried himself with a confidence I didn't remember from his younger years. But what struck me most was how much he resembled Vincent. The resemblance had always been there, but now, seeing Marcus as a fully grown man, the similarity was almost startling. He had his father's penetrating dark eyes, his strong jaw, his way of surveying a room before settling his attention on his target. For a moment, it was like seeing Vincent walk through that door, and I had to grip the edge of the table to study myself. "Mom," Marcus said, and his voice carried a warmth I hadn't heard in years. He approached the table with quick steps and wrapped me in a hug that felt genuine and desperate. "I've missed you so much." I held him tightly, breathing in the scent of his cologne and the familiar warmth of my child. "I've missed you too, sweetheart, so much." We spent the first hour catching up on the basics. Marcus told me about his travels, his various jobs and business ventures, his life in Los Angeles, where he had been living for the past 3 years. He asked about my health, my plans, how I was coping with Vincent's death. The conversation felt natural and loving,
like we were picking up from a pause rather than bridging an 8-year gap. It wasn't until we ordered our second round of coffee that Marcus shifted the conversation to more serious territory. "Mom, I need to talk to you about Dad's estate. I heard through some mutual friends that there were some significant assets involved." I felt a small chill at the change in his tone, but I attributed it to natural curiosity. After all, Marcus was Vincent's son. He had a right to know about his father's financial situation. "Your father was more successful than either of us realized," I said carefully. "He left me very well provided for." Marcus leaned forward, his expression intensely focused. "How well provided for are we talking about, Mom? I mean, I know Dad was always conservative with money, but some of the things I've heard, I want to make sure you're not being taken advantage of by financial advisors or lawyers." The concern in his voice sounded genuine, and I found myself wanting to share the overwhelming burden of managing such wealth. For months, I had been navigating this new reality alone, making decisions about investments and charitable giving and financial planning without anyone to talk to who truly understood the magnitude of what I was dealing with. "It's substantial, Marcus," I admitted, "more than I ever imagined possible. Your father left me approximately $200 million. The change in Marcus's expression was subtle, but unmistakable. His eyes widened slightly, and I saw him take a quick, sharp breath. For just a moment, his mask of concern slipped away, and I glimpsed something that looked like excitement or calculation. But the expression was so brief that I almost convinced myself I had imagined it. $200 million? Marcus repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. "Mom, that's—"
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
That's incredible. And you're managing all of that alone? "I have Harrison Webb helping me," I explained. "Your father's attorney. He's been wonderful about guiding me through everything." Marcus nodded thoughtfully, but I noticed that his attention seemed to have sharpened considerably. The relaxed, casual demeanor he had maintained throughout our earlier conversation was replaced by something more intense and focused. "That's a tremendous responsibility," he said, "and a tremendous opportunity. Have you thought about what you want to do with all of that wealth?" I had been thinking about it constantly, actually. Vincent and I had never had the chance to discuss his intentions for the money, and I felt the weight of making decisions that would honor his memory while also reflecting my own values. "I've been considering various charitable foundations," I said. "Education, medical research, programs for underprivileged children. Your father always believed in giving back." "That's beautiful, Mom," Marcus said, reaching across the table to take my hand. "But I hope you're also thinking about enjoying some of it yourself. You've worked hard your whole life. You deserve to experience some of the pleasures that kind of wealth can provide." There was something in his tone that made me uncomfortable, though I couldn't quite identify what it was. Marcus had always been charming and persuasive, even as a child, but there was something different about the way he was looking at me now. Something that reminded me uncomfortably of the way he had looked at Vincent during those final arguments about money. "I don't need much to be happy," I told him honestly. "Your father and I were content with a simple life. I'm not sure extreme wealth would change that for me." Marcus's grip on my hand tightened slightly. "But Mom, think about what you could do. You could travel anywhere in the world, buy homes in places you've always dreamed of visiting. You could start businesses, invest in causes you care about, make a real difference in the world." "I suppose," I said, though something about his enthusiasm felt forced. "Right now, I'm still just trying to process it all. It's only been 3 months since your father died, and learning about the extent of his wealth has been overwhelming." "Of course," Marcus said quickly. "I can't imagine how difficult this has been for you, losing Dad and then having to deal with all of these financial complexities on your own." He paused, seeming to consider his words carefully. "Maybe I could help you with some of that burden." And there it was. The real reason for his sudden desire to reconnect presented so smoothly that I almost missed the calculated nature of it. Almost. "Help me how?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral. "Well, I've learned a lot about business and investments over the years.
I know my previous ventures didn't work out the way Dad had hoped, but I've gained valuable experience. I could help you evaluate opportunities, maybe even manage some of the day-to-day financial decisions so you don't have to worry about them. I studied my son's face, looking for some sign of the genuine emotion that had characterized our earlier conversation. Instead, I saw something that reminded me painfully of his father's descriptions of Marcus during their business discussions. Vincent had always said that Marcus had the intelligence and charisma to be successful, but lacked the patience and integrity necessary for long-term achievement. "That's a generous offer," I said slowly. "But I think for now, I'm comfortable with the arrangements Vincent made. Harrison has been handling everything beautifully." I saw a flash of something, disappointment, frustration, cross his features before he recovered his composure. "Of course, Mom. I just want you to know that I'm here for you now. Whatever you need, whatever you decide, I want to be part of your life again." I want that too. And I meant it. Despite my growing unease about his motivations, Marcus was still my son, still the child I had loved and missed for 8 years. But let's take it slowly. We have a lot of lost time to make up for. Marcus smiled, but the warmth didn't quite reach his eyes. "Absolutely. In fact, I was hoping we could spend more time together over the next few weeks. I'm planning to stay in the area for a while, maybe rent a place nearby so we can really reconnect." "You're moving back to New York?"
I asked, surprised. "Temporarily," he said. "I realized after Dad died that I've been running away from family for too long. It's time I came home and started rebuilding the relationships that matter." The words were exactly what I wanted to hear, but something about the timing felt too convenient. Marcus had shown no interest in rebuilding family relationships while his father was alive to benefit from reconciliation. Now, with Vincent gone and a fortune revealed, my son was suddenly ready to come home and be the devoted child he had never been before. Still, I wanted to believe in the possibility of redemption. I wanted to believe that people could change, that loss could teach valuable lessons, that my son might genuinely be ready to prioritize family over financial gain. I decided to give him the benefit of the doubt, at least for the time being. "I'd like that," I said. "It would be wonderful to have you close by again." We spent another hour talking about lighter topics, his memories of growing up in Westchester, mutual friends he wanted to reconnect with, places in the area that had changed during his absence. By the time we parted ways, I felt cautiously optimistic about the possibility of rebuilding our relationship. But as I drove home, I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had changed in Marcus during our years apart. The son who hugged me goodbye outside the bistro looked like my child, sounded like my child, but something essential seemed different, something that made me think of Vincent's warnings about how money changes people and how difficult it becomes to distinguish between genuine affection and calculated interest once significant wealth enters the equation. That evening, I sat in Vincent's study, surrounded by the financial documents that had become such an overwhelming part of my daily life. I found myself wondering what my husband would think of Marcus's sudden desire to reconcile. Vincent had always been suspicious of people's motives when it came to money, perhaps because his own wealth had attracted so many individuals who saw him as an opportunity rather than a person. I pulled out a photograph of Marcus from his college graduation, back when our family had been whole and happy. He looked so young and earnest in his cap and gown, standing between Vincent and me with his arms around both of us. That was the son I remembered, the child I had raised to value integrity and kindness over material success. I wanted desperately to believe that version of Marcus still existed somewhere beneath the polished, calculating man I had met for coffee. But as I prepared for bed that night, I made a mental note to be very careful about how much information I shared regarding Vincent's financial arrangements. Something told me that my son's interest in my welfare might not be as pure as I wanted to believe. The next morning brought another text from Marcus. "Thank you for yesterday, Mom. It meant the world to me to see you again. I found a furnished apartment in Scarsdale for the month. Can't wait to spend more time together." Scarsdale was only 15 minutes from my house, close enough for frequent visits but far enough to maintain some independence. It seemed like a reasonable choice for someone genuinely interested in rebuilding family connections gradually.
Over the following week, Marcus was a model of attentiveness. He called daily to check on me, stopped by twice to share meals and help with small household tasks, and generally behaved like the loving son I had always hoped he would become. He asked thoughtful questions about my grief process, shared memories of his father that were genuinely touching, and seemed to be making a real effort to reconnect with me as a person, rather than just as a source of financial opportunity. But gradually, subtly, he began introducing topics related to my inheritance with increasing frequency. It started with innocent questions about whether I was comfortable with Harrison's investment strategies, whether I felt confident in my ability to make decisions about such large sums of money, whether I had considered the tax implications of various charitable giving options. Initially, I appreciated his concern and his willingness to engage with the complexities of managing Vincent's estate. It felt good to have someone to discuss these overwhelming responsibilities with, especially someone who shared my grief over Vincent's death and my uncertainty about the future. But as the days passed, Marcus's questions became more specific and more pressing. He wanted to know exact details about the investment portfolios, the real estate holdings, the timeline for various financial decisions. He began offering increasingly specific advice about how I should handle certain aspects of the estate, advice that always seemed to involve giving him more information and more influence over my financial affairs. The turning point came during our second week of renewed contact. Marcus had come over for dinner, and we were having coffee in Vincent's study when he noticed the estate planning documents Harrison had prepared for me to review. "What are those?" he asked, gesturing toward the papers. "Updated will and trust documents," I explained. "Harrison thinks I should update my estate planning now that the financial picture has changed so dramatically." Marcus's attention sharpened immediately. "That makes sense. Have you decided how you want to structure things?" I hesitated, suddenly feeling uncomfortable with the intensity of his interest. "I'm still considering my options." "Mom," he said, moving closer and taking on the tone of voice he had used as a teenager when he wanted something important. "I hope you know that I'm not here because of Dad's money. I'm here because I realized I was wrong to let pride keep me away from my family for so long." "I know that, though I was no longer certain I believed it. But I also hope you know that I want to be here for you in every way possible, including helping you manage the responsibilities that come with this kind of wealth. You shouldn't have to carry this burden alone." There was that word again, burden. The same word Harrison had used to describe Vincent's protective approach to wealth management. But when Harrison said it, it sounded like genuine concern for my welfare. When Marcus said it, it sounded like an opportunity he was eager to share.
"I appreciate your concern," I said carefully, "but I'm not sure I'm ready to make any major changes to the arrangements Vincent put in place." I saw a flash of frustration cross Marcus's face before he controlled his expression. "Of course not. I just want you to know that when you are ready, I'm here to help." That night, after Marcus left, I found myself thinking about Vincent's relationship with his son during Marcus's childhood and adolescence. Vincent had loved Marcus deeply, but he had also been deeply disappointed by what he saw as Marcus's lack of character when it came to money and responsibility. The failed businesses Marcus had asked Vincent to fund hadn't failed because of bad luck or poor market conditions. They had failed because Marcus had made impulsive, poorly researched decisions and then expected his father to cover the losses without consequence. Vincent had tried to teach Marcus about financial responsibility, about the difference between taking calculated risks and gambling with other people's money. But Marcus had interpreted his father's caution as stinginess and his expectations of accountability as lack of faith. The final argument between them had been more than money. It had been about fundamental differences in values and character. Now, sitting alone in Vincent's study, I began to wonder if those fundamental differences still existed. Had Marcus truly learned from his failures, or was he simply more sophisticated in his approach to accessing family wealth? The timing of his reconciliation, coming so soon after learning about Vincent's estate, suggested the latter possibility. I decided to test my suspicions in small ways, to see how Marcus responded to different scenarios involving money and family responsibility. Over the next few days, I mentioned several fictional situations,
an old friend asking for a loan, a charity requesting a large donation, a potential investment opportunity Harrison had described, and watched Marcus's reactions carefully. In each case, Marcus's response revealed a pattern. When the situation involved me giving money away to others, he was full of cautions about being taken advantage of and suggestions that I should be more careful about protecting my assets. When the situation involved potential financial gain, he was enthusiastic about the opportunities such wealth could create and eager to be involved in the decision-making process. The pattern was subtle but consistent, and it painted a picture of someone who saw my inheritance not as my security, but as our opportunity. Marcus had apparently decided that Vincent's death and my sudden wealth represented his chance to access the family fortune he had been denied during his father's lifetime. The realization was heartbreaking, but it also awakened something in me that I hadn't felt since Vincent's death. For months, I had been grieving and lost, overwhelmed by responsibilities I hadn't chosen and wealth I hadn't earned. But now, faced with the possibility that my own son was attempting to manipulate me for financial gain, I felt a clarity and determination I hadn't experienced in years. If Marcus thought he could play on my grief and loneliness to access Vincent's carefully protected assets, he was about to learn that he had inherited more than just his father's looks. He had also inherited a mother who was far stronger and more observant than he had given her credit for. It was time to find out exactly what my son's intentions were and to protect not just Vincent's legacy, but my own future from someone who might see both as nothing more than opportunities to be exploited. The game Marcus thought he was playing was about to become much more complex than he had anticipated. 2 weeks after our reunion, Marcus made his first direct move. He arrived at my house on a Saturday morning with coffee and pastries from the bakery I loved, along with a folder full of investment prospectuses and business plans. "Mom, I've been doing some research," he said, settling into the chair across from me in the breakfast nook where Vincent and I used to read the morning paper together. "I think I found some opportunities that might interest you." I accepted the coffee gratefully, but eyed the folder with suspicion. "What kind of opportunities?" "Well," Marcus said, opening the folder with the enthusiasm of a salesman making his pitch, "I've been looking into some emerging technology companies, green energy investments, that sort of thing. The kind of forward-thinking ventures that Dad would have appreciated." He spread several glossy brochures across the table, each featuring impressive charts and promising significant returns on investment. But as I scanned the materials, I noticed that several of the companies were based in Los Angeles, and one listed Marcus Castellano as a founding partner. "This one looks interesting," I said, picking up the brochure for the company that bore his name. "Tell me about your involvement with them." Marcus had the grace to look slightly embarrassed. "Actually, that's my company. I started it about 6 months ago with some partners I met in LA. We're developing sustainable packaging solutions for the food service industry." "And you need investors." "We need capital to scale up production." "But Mom, the potential is incredible. We've already got preliminary interest from several major restaurant chains, and the environmental impact could be huge." I set the brochure down carefully, studying my son's face. He looked earnest and passionate the way he had looked when describing his previous ventures to Vincent. But I also saw something else, the slightly desperate edge of someone who needed money quickly and saw me as his best chance of getting it. "How much capital are you looking for?" "We're seeking $5 million in initial funding, but for an investor like you, someone who really believes in the mission, we'd be willing to offer a significant ownership stake." $5 million. The amount was substantial enough to represent serious money, even within the context of Vincent's estate, but seemed small enough to be put forward as both a family gesture and a smart business decision. "It sounds like an interesting opportunity," I said noncommittally, "but I'd want to have Harrison review all the financials before making any decisions." The mention of Vincent's attorney clearly made Marcus uncomfortable. "Of course," he said quickly, "though I was hoping we could keep this within the family initially."
You know how conservative lawyers can be about innovative investments. "Harrison isn't just conservative," I said. "He's careful. There's a difference." Marcus nodded, but I could see him calculating behind his eyes, trying to figure out how to navigate around Harrison's involvement. "What if I put together a complete business plan for you to review first? something you could look at privately before involving the lawyers? I suppose that would be fine, I agreed, though I had no intention of making any investment decisions without professional guidance. Marcus's relief was obvious. Perfect. I can have everything together by Monday. After he left, I sat at my kitchen table staring at the investment materials he had left behind. The sustainable packaging company might have been a legitimate business opportunity, but the way Marcus had presented it felt manipulative and rehearsed. He had clearly been planning this pitch for some time, possibly since our first coffee meeting. I found myself wondering how many other family members of wealthy individuals received similar presentations from estranged children who suddenly wanted to reconnect. The pattern was probably depressingly common. Grief-stricken widows approached by family members who had calculated the value of renewed relationships based on inheritance amounts, rather than genuine affection. That afternoon, I called Harrison and asked him to meet with me privately. His office felt like a sanctuary, a place where I could speak honestly about my concerns without worrying about family dynamics or emotional manipulation. I need to ask you about something, I said, settling into the leather chair across from his desk. Something confidential. Harrison set down his pen and gave me his full attention. Of course, Elena. What's on your mind? Marcus has come back, I said. He wants to reconcile, and I want to believe his motives are pure, but I'm starting to have doubts. I told Harrison about the coffee meeting, the sudden interest in my financial affairs, and the morning's investment pitch. Harrison listened without interruption, his expression growing more serious as I described the progression of Marcus's behavior. I see, Harrison said when I finished. And what does your instinct tell you about his motivations? My instinct tells me that he found out about Vincent's estate and decided that reconciliation might be profitable, I admitted. But I don't want to believe that about my own son. Harrison leaned back in his chair, choosing his words carefully. Elena, you should know that Vincent was very concerned about this exact scenario. What do you mean? Vincent specifically structured his will to protect you from family members who might attempt to manipulate you after his death, Harrison explained. He was worried that Marcus might view your inheritance as an opportunity rather than your security. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. My husband had anticipated this situation, had seen the potential for his son to behave exactly as Marcus was behaving now. My husband had protected me from a betrayal he knew might come, even from beyond the grave. Did Vincent say something specific about Marcus? I asked. He said that Marcus had never learned to distinguish between earning money and taking money, Harrison replied, and he was afraid that access to significant wealth might bring out the worst in people who hadn't earned it themselves. I sat in silence for several minutes, processing the implications of Vincent's foresight. My husband knew his son well enough to predict this behavior, but I had been too hopeful, too eager for reconciliation to see the warning signs clearly. What should I do? I asked finally. That depends on what you want to achieve, Harrison said. If you want to give Marcus the benefit of the doubt and see if he's genuinely changed, that's your prerogative. But I would strongly advise against making any financial commitments until you're absolutely certain of his motivations. And if I want to test those motivations? Harrison smiled slightly. Vincent would have approved of that approach. He believed in giving people enough rope to either climb to safety or hang themselves. We spent the next hour discussing strategies for evaluating Marcus's true intentions without putting Vincent's carefully protected assets at risk. Harrison suggested several approaches that would allow me to observe my son's behavior under different circumstances, particularly when faced with the possibility that accessing my wealth might be more difficult than he had anticipated. By the time I left Harrison's office, I had a plan. It wasn't a plan I was particularly happy about. No mother wants to set traps for her own child.
But it was a plan that would give me the information I needed to make informed decisions about Marcus's role in my life going forward. On Monday morning, Marcus arrived with a comprehensive business plan for his packaging company, complete with financial projections, market analysis, and testimonials from potential customers. He had clearly worked through the weekend to prepare materials that would impress a sophisticated investor. "This looks very thorough," I said, accepting the bound presentation he handed me. "You've put a lot of work into this. I wanted you to see how serious I am about this opportunity and how serious I am about rebuilding our relationship based on mutual respect and shared goals."
I flipped through the pages, noting the professional quality of the presentation and the careful attention to detail. Whatever else might be true about Marcus, he wasn't approaching this as a casual request for money. He had invested significant time and effort in making his case. "I'll need some time to review all of this," I said, "and I'll probably want to have Harrison look at the legal aspects." Marcus's jaw tightened slightly at the mention of the attorney. "Mom, I hope you don't mind me saying this, but I'm a little concerned about how much influence Harrison has over your financial decisions." "How so?" "Well, he was Dad's attorney, not yours," Marcus said carefully. "His loyalty is to Dad's wishes, not necessarily to what might be best for you now." It was a clever argument, designed to create doubt about Harrison's motivations while positioning Marcus as the person who truly had my best interests at heart. But it also revealed something important about my son's strategy. He saw Harrison as an obstacle to his plans, which suggested those plans might not withstand professional scrutiny. "Harrison has been very helpful," I said neutrally, "but I appreciate your concern. I just think you should consider whether you want to spend the rest of your life being managed by someone else's decisions." Marcus continued, "Dad was brilliant, but he made those estate planning choices based on his own priorities and his own relationship with money. Your priorities might be different." "They might be," I agreed. "What do you think my priorities should be?" Marcus leaned forward, his expression earnest and persuasive. "I think you should prioritize living fully, experiencing everything your wealth can offer, and building a legacy that reflects your own values rather than Dad's conservative approach. And supporting your business ventures fits into that? How?" "Because it represents everything Dad never understood about taking smart risks. He was so focused on preserving wealth that he never saw the opportunities to create real positive change in the world." The criticism of Vincent stung, but it also revealed something crucial about Marcus's worldview. He genuinely believed that his father had been wrong to be cautious with money, that Vincent's approach to wealth management had been based on fear rather than wisdom. Marcus saw my inheritance not as Vincent's legacy to be protected, but as capital to be deployed in service of goals Vincent would never have approved of. "That's an interesting perspective," I said. "Let me think about it." That evening, I called Harrison and initiated the first phase of our plan to test Marcus's motivations. It was a test I desperately hoped my son would pass, but one I feared he would fail spectacularly. "I need you to prepare some documents for me," I told Harrison. "Documents that will help me understand exactly what kind of man my son has become." The documents Harrison prepared were elegant in their simplicity. A fake letter from the IRS claiming there were complications with Vincent's estate that would freeze my assets for an indefinite period pending investigation, a fabricated notice from the investment firm managing the largest portion of my portfolio announcing unexpected losses due to market volatility, a fictional communication from Vincent's business partners demanding immediate repayment of loans I hadn't known existed. None of it was real, but all of it was designed to create the impression that my financial situation had suddenly become precarious. Harrison had crafted each document with enough technical detail to be convincing, but not so much complexity that I couldn't explain the supposed problems to Marcus in simple terms. "Are you sure you want to do this?" Harrison asked as he handed me the folder containing our manufactured crisis. "Once you show these to Marcus, there's no going back. You'll know definitively what kind of person your son has become."
I took the folder with hands that trembled slightly. Vincent was right about people and money, wasn't he? It really does reveal who they are underneath all the pretense. In my experience, extreme wealth acts like a truth serum. It strips away polite facades and shows people's real priorities. Unfortunately, those priorities aren't always what their loved ones hope to discover. That evening, I called Marcus and asked him to come over for dinner. I needed to control the environment for this test, needed to observe his reactions carefully without distractions or interruptions. When he arrived, he was carrying flowers and a bottle of wine, playing the role of the devoted son with practiced ease. "You sounded upset on the phone," he said, kissing my cheek with what seemed like genuine concern. "Is everything okay?" "I've had some troubling news about the estate. I wanted to talk to you about it." Marcus's attention immediately focused on the papers, and I saw his body language shift from casual concern to sharp alertness. "What kind of news?" I picked up the fake IRS letter first, watching his face as I explained the supposed investigation into Vincent's financial affairs. According to the fabricated document, irregularities in some of Vincent's international investments had triggered a federal inquiry that could freeze the entire estate for years, while investigators sorted through decades of complex transactions. "This is serious," Marcus said, taking the letter and scanning it quickly. "How much of your assets could be affected?" "Potentially all of it," I said, noting how his first question had been about the money rather than about my well-being or emotional state. "The letter says they have the authority to freeze everything until their investigation is complete."
I watched Marcus read through the document more carefully, his jaw tightening as he absorbed the implications. When he looked up, his expression was controlled, but I could see the calculation happening behind his eyes. "Have you talked to Harrison about this?" he asked. "He's the one who received the initial notice," I replied. "He says there's not much we can do except wait and cooperate with the investigation." Marcus set down the IRS letter and picked up the investment firm notice, which detailed supposed losses in the tech sector that had eliminated nearly $30 million from my portfolio overnight. His hands were steady as he read, but I noticed a muscle in his temple begin to twitch. "This is a disaster," he said quietly. "Mom, this could wipe out everything." "Not everything," I said, picking up the third document. "But this makes things even more complicated." The fake letter from Vincent's business partners was perhaps the cruelest of Harrison's fabrications because it played on the loving memories I had shared with Marcus about his father. According to the document, Vincent had personally guaranteed several business loans totaling $40 million, and with his death, those guarantees had become my responsibility. Marcus read the letter twice before setting it down with carefully controlled movements. "When did you find out about these loans?" "Harrison discovered them yesterday when he was reviewing some of Vincent's private files," I said. "Apparently, your father was more leveraged than any of us realized." The silence that followed was heavy with Marcus's internal struggle. I could practically see him recalculating his expectations, adjusting his plans to account for this dramatically altered financial landscape. When he finally spoke, his voice was tight with barely controlled emotion. "So, what does this mean exactly? How much are we talking about in terms of your actual available assets?" "We. Not you, but we, as if my financial crisis had automatically become his financial crisis, as if Vincent's estate was a shared resource rather than my individual inheritance. Harrison estimates that between the frozen accounts, the investment losses, and the loan obligations, I might be looking at liquid assets of maybe $10 or $15 million, I said, assuming the IRS investigation doesn't uncover more problems. I watched Marcus absorb this information, watched him recalibrate his entire approach to our renewed relationship based on a dramatically reduced estimate of my wealth. $10 or $15 million was still a substantial sum by most standards, but it wasn't the limitless fortune he had been expecting to access. "This changes everything," he said, more to himself than to me. "What do you mean?" Marcus looked up sharply as if he had forgotten I was there. "I mean, this changes your whole financial picture. You're going to need to be much more careful about how you handle your remaining assets." "More careful how?"
Well, for starters, you can't afford to make any large charitable commitments until this all gets sorted out, he said. And you definitely can't afford to make risky investments in unproven ventures. The last comment was clearly a reference to his own business proposal, and the ease with which he dismissed his own opportunity revealed something important about his priorities. When he thought I had $200 million, investing $5 million in his company seemed like a reasonable request. Now that he believed my available assets were much smaller, his own business needs had suddenly become an unaffordable risk. So, you think I should withdraw your business proposal? I asked. Under these circumstances, absolutely, Marcus said without hesitation. Mom, you need to focus on preserving what you have left, not on growing it through speculative investments. I felt a cold certainty settle in my chest. If Marcus had genuinely been interested in rebuilding our relationship, if his business proposal had been based on real belief in his company's potential rather than opportunistic access to my wealth, he would have tried to convince me that his venture was exactly the kind of investment that could help me recover from these supposed financial setbacks. Instead, he had immediately written off his own proposal the moment my circumstances appeared less favorable to him. His business wasn't worth investing in when doing so might compromise his long-term access to my remaining assets. That's probably wise, I agreed, though I have to admit, I was looking forward to supporting something you were passionate about. Marcus reached over and took my hand, his expression shifting into what I was beginning to recognize as his practice compassionate mode. Mom, I'm passionate about making sure you're secure and comfortable for the rest of your life. Everything else is secondary to that. The words were exactly what a loving son should say in such circumstances, but they rang hollow given what I had just observed about his real priorities. Marcus was passionate about ensuring my security only so far as that security represented his own future inheritance. What do you think I should do? I asked, genuinely curious about how he would advise me to handle this manufactured crisis. First, you need better financial advice than Harrison is giving you. No offense to him, but this situation requires expertise in crisis management and asset protection. I have some contacts in LA who specialize in exactly these kinds of problems. Of course he did, and naturally those contacts would be people who might be more amenable to his involvement in managing my financial affairs than Harrison had proven to be. You think I should replace Harrison? I think you should at least get a second opinion, Marcus said. Someone who doesn't have decades of personal history with Dad clouding their judgment. It was fascinating to watch Marcus work. Every suggestion he made was presented as being in my best interest, but every suggestion also happened to serve his own goals of gaining more influence over my financial decisions while reducing Harrison's role as my protector and advisor. I'll think about it, I said. In the meantime, what do you think about the idea of me selling the house? This was another test Harrison and I had discussed. The house in Westchester was valuable, worth several $1,000,000, but it was also my home, filled with decades of memories and representing the last physical connection I had to my life with Vincent. A son who genuinely cared about my emotional well-being would be reluctant to see me give up something so personally meaningful. A son who saw me primarily as a financial opportunity would focus on the liquidity such a sale could provide. Marcus didn't hesitate. I think that's a smart idea, he said immediately. This house is way too big for you anyway, and the maintenance costs must be enormous. You could buy something smaller and more manageable, maybe a nice condo in Manhattan, and bank the difference. It would be hard to leave, I said, watching his reaction carefully. Vincent and I were so happy here. This is where we raised you, where all our best family memories happened. I understand the sentimental value, Marcus said, but his tone suggested he considered sentimentality a luxury I could no longer afford. But Mom, you have to be practical. This house represents millions of dollars in equity that you could be using to stabilize your financial situation. There it was again. Practicality over sentiment. Financial considerations over emotional needs. Marcus was advising me to abandon the home where I had been happy for decades in service of asset preservation that would ultimately benefit him more than me. Maybe you're right, I said sadly. It's just hard to think about starting over at my age. You're not starting over, Marcus said, squeezing my hand. You're adapting to new circumstances, and you won't be doing it alone. I'm here now, and I'm going to help you through this. The promise sounded warm and supportive, but I heard the underlying message clearly. Marcus was positioning himself as my primary support system, the person I should rely on to navigate this crisis, the family member who would be there when professional advisors and old friends proved inadequate to the challenge. We spent the next hour discussing various aspects of my supposed financial problems, and in every case, Marcus's advice followed the same pattern: reduce expenses, liquidate assets, avoid risks, and rely on his guidance to make decisions that would protect what remained of my wealth. Not once did he suggest that I might want to fight the IRS investigation or challenge the investment losses. Not once did he recommend getting multiple opinions about the supposed loan obligations. His advice was entirely focused on accepting these setbacks and adapting to reduced circumstances, which suggested that he was already thinking about how to maximize his access to whatever assets survived the crisis. When Marcus left that evening, he hugged me tightly and promised to call his contacts in Los Angeles the next morning to get recommendations for financial advisors who could help me navigate this difficult situation. He kissed my forehead and told me not to worry, that everything would work out as long as we were smart about our choices going forward. Our choices. There it was again, the assumption that my financial crisis was a shared problem requiring joint decision-making. Marcus had seamlessly transitioned from interested observer to active participant in my financial affairs, all under the guise of being a supportive son, helping his mother through a difficult time. After he left, I sat in Vincent's study, surrounded by the fake documents that had revealed so much about my son's true character. The test had been successful in that it had provided definitive answers to questions I hadn't wanted to ask. But success in this context felt hollow and heartbreaking. Marcus had failed every aspect of the evaluation. When faced with my supposed financial crisis, he had immediately focused on the money rather than my emotional well-being. He had withdrawn his business proposal the moment it became inconvenient for his long-term goals. He advised me to sell my family home without any consideration for the emotional cost of such a decision. And he had positioned himself as my primary financial advisor while systematically undermining my relationship with the professionals Vincent had trusted to protect me. Worst of all, he had done it all while maintaining the facade of being a loving, concerned son. Every selfish recommendation had been wrapped in language of protection and support. Every self-serving suggestion had been presented as being in my best interest. Marcus wasn't just greedy, he was manipulative in ways that made his greed even more dangerous. I called Harrison at home despite the late hour and gave him a complete report of the evening's events. He listened without interruption as I described Marcus's reactions and advice, occasionally making small sounds of disapproval as the pattern of behavior became clear. "I'm sorry, Elena," he said when I finished. "I know you were hoping for different results." "Were you?" I asked. "You knew Vincent better than anyone. Did you really think Marcus might have changed?" Harrison was quiet for a long moment. "I hoped he might have learned something from losing his father," he said finally. "But Vincent always said that people don't really change, they just get better at hiding who they've always been."
So, what do I do now? I can't keep pretending there's a financial crisis indefinitely, and I can't pretend I don't know what kind of person my son really is. That depends on what outcome you want, Harrison said. If you want to give Marcus access to your wealth and hope he'll be grateful enough to provide genuine companionship in return, that's your choice. But you should go into such an arrangement with realistic expectations about his motivations. And if I want to protect Vincent's legacy from someone who would squander it, then we need to accelerate some of the asset protection strategies Vincent put in place, Harrison said. There are legal structures we can implement that would make it very difficult for Marcus to access your wealth, even if something happened to you. The conversation that followed was technical and depressing, focused on trusts and foundations and legal mechanisms designed to protect assets from family members who might not have the beneficiary's best interests at heart.
Vincent had anticipated this possibility and had given Harrison broad authority to implement additional protections if circumstances required them. "There is something else we need to discuss," Harrison said as our conversation was winding down. "Marcus mentioned contacts in Los Angeles who could provide financial advice. In my experience, when estranged family members start suggesting new professional advisors, it's usually because they found people who are willing to be more flexible about fiduciary responsibilities." The implication was clear. Marcus wasn't just trying to gain influence over my financial decisions. He was trying to replace my current advisors with people who might be more amenable to arrangements that served his interests rather than mine. "You think he's already talked to these people about my situation?" I asked. "I think Marcus has been planning this reconciliation much more carefully than he's led you to believe," Harrison replied. "And I think you should be prepared for his approach to become more aggressive now that he believes your financial position is weaker than he initially thought." Harrison was right. Over the next few days, Marcus's behavior shifted noticeably. Where he had previously been patient and gradual in his suggestions about my financial affairs, he now became urgent and insistent. He called multiple times each day to check on my emotional state and to offer new ideas for managing the supposed crisis. He arrived at my house Wednesday morning with coffee and a folder full of information about financial advisors in Manhattan who specialized in what he called wealth preservation under adverse circumstances. All of the advisors he recommended were people he had worked with personally, people who understood the importance of family involvement in major financial decisions. "I've already spoken to 2 of them about your situation," Marcus said, spreading brochures across my kitchen table. Obviously, I didn't give them any specifics, but I wanted to get a sense of their approach to cases like yours. Cases like mine. As if wealthy widows facing manufactured financial crises were a common category requiring specialized handling. "What did they say?" I asked, though I was more interested in the fact that he had taken the initiative to contact potential advisors without discussing it with me first. "They both agreed that your current legal and financial team might not have the right expertise for this situation," Marcus said. "They recommended acting quickly to protect your remaining assets before the situation gets worse." "Worse how?" Marcus leaned forward, his expression serious and concerned. "Mom, these IRS investigations can snowball. If they find irregularities in one area of Dad's finances, they'll start looking at everything. And if your current advisors don't have experience with federal financial investigations, they might inadvertently make decisions that complicate your situation." It was a compelling argument, designed to create urgency and fear about my current professional relationships while positioning Marcus's recommended advisors as the solution to problems I didn't actually have. "Harrison has been handling complex financial matters for 30 years, I pointed out. "I'm sure he's dealt with IRS issues before. But has he dealt with cases involving this level of wealth and complexity?" Marcus asked. "Mom, we're talking about potentially criminal financial irregularities in international investment structures. That's not the kind of thing most estate attorneys handle on a regular basis." Criminal financial irregularities. Marcus was escalating the supposed seriousness of my situation, creating a crisis that would justify dramatic changes to my financial management structure. If I accepted his characterization of the problem, it would be almost impossible to argue against bringing in new advisors who claim to have relevant expertise. "You really think it's that serious?" I asked. "I think you can't afford to assume it's not that serious. And I think the longer you wait to bring in the right kind of help, the fewer options you'll have." That afternoon, Marcus arranged for me to speak by phone with one of his recommended financial advisors, a man named Richard Blackwood, who claimed to specialize in high net worth crisis management. The conversation was professionally conducted, but deeply unsettling, as Blackwood seemed to have detailed knowledge of my supposed financial problems, despite me never having spoken to him before. "Your son has briefed me on the general outlines of your situation, and while I can't offer specific advice without a more complete review of your assets and obligations, I can tell you that time is of the essence in cases like this." Cases like what exactly? Wealthy individuals facing simultaneous challenges from multiple directions. Federal investigations, investment losses, and unexpected debt obligations create a perfect storm that can destroy even substantial fortunes if not handled properly. The language he used was designed to sound authoritative and reassuring, but something about his tone made me uncomfortable. He spoke about my wealth as if it were a technical problem to be solved, rather than a personal resource that represented my security and independence. What kind of handling do you recommend? Immediate asset consolidation and protection, Blackwood replied without hesitation.
Moving your liquid assets into structures that can't be touched by federal investigators or creditors, establishing offshore accounts for maximum privacy, and creating legal firewalls between you and your husband's business obligations. Offshore accounts, legal firewalls. The recommendations sounded sophisticated and protective, but they also sounded like the kind of financial arrangements that might be difficult to monitor or reverse once they were in place. That sounds complicated, I said. Wealth preservation always involves some complexity, Blackwood agreed. But the alternative is watching your assets disappear into federal bureaucracy and creditor claims. Your son is right to be concerned about your current advisor's ability to handle this level of sophistication. After the call ended, I sat in my kitchen trying to process what was happening. Marcus had not only contacted potential financial advisors on my behalf, he had apparently provided them with detailed information about my supposed financial crisis and had positioned them to recommend exactly the kind of dramatic changes to my asset management that would serve his interests. The coordination was impressive and deeply disturbing. Marcus wasn't just opportunistically trying to benefit from my wealth. He was orchestrating a systematic campaign to gain control over my financial affairs by creating artificial urgency around problems that didn't exist. That evening, Harrison came to my house for what we had agreed would be our final strategy session before I decided how to confront Marcus about his behavior. The fake documents had served their purpose in revealing my son's true motivations, but continuing the charade much longer would risk creating real complications in my actual financial affairs. "He's moving faster than I expected," Harrison admitted as I described the day's events, "and he's being more sophisticated about it. This isn't amateur opportunism. This is a coordinated plan to separate you from your current advisors and move your assets into structures he can influence." "You think he's done this before?" "I think Marcus has spent the 8 years since his father cut him off learning how to access family wealth through more subtle means than direct requests for investment capital," Harrison said. "This reconciliation was never about rebuilding your relationship. It was about positioning himself to inherit or control your assets without having to wait for you to die." The bluntness of Harrison's assessment was jarring, but it aligned perfectly with everything I had observed about Marcus's behavior since his return. My son hadn't come home to reconnect with his mother. He had come home to execute a business plan that treated my grief and loneliness as opportunities to be exploited. "So, what's my next move?" I asked. Harrison smiled grimly. "I think it's time to show Marcus exactly what kind of woman his father married." The plan Harrison and I developed was elegant in its simplicity. Rather than confronting Marcus directly about his deception, we would give him exactly what he thought he wanted: the opportunity to demonstrate his financial expertise by helping me navigate the manufactured crisis he believed I was facing. Harrison prepared a new set of documents, these ones even more sophisticated than our initial fabrications. A follow-up letter from the IRS demanding immediate documentation of all international transactions over the past decade. A notice from the investment firm announcing additional losses that reduced my liquid assets to less than $5 million. A communication from Vincent's business partners demanding immediate payment of the full $40 million loan guarantee. But this time, we added one crucial element: a proposed solution that would require Marcus to reveal the full extent of his plan to access my wealth. According to our fabricated crisis scenario, the only way to protect my remaining assets from complete seizure would be to immediately transfer them to a family member who could hold them in trust until the legal complications were resolved.
The proposal, supposedly developed by Richard Blackwood and his team, would require Marcus to accept legal responsibility for managing my wealth during the crisis period. If Marcus was genuinely concerned about my well-being and had no ulterior motives regarding my money, he would be reluctant to accept such responsibility and would encourage me to find alternative solutions that didn't put family relationships at risk. But if Marcus's primary goal was gaining access to my wealth, he would eagerly accept the opportunity to become the legal guardian of assets he had been trying to influence from the beginning. The test was designed to be definitive. By the end of the week, I would know beyond any doubt whether my son saw me as a mother to be protected or as an obstacle between me and Vincent's fortune. Thursday morning, I called Marcus and asked him to meet me at Harrison's office for what I described as an emergency strategy session. He arrived within an hour, his expression tight with what appeared to be genuine concern, which I was beginning to recognize as barely contained excitement about the opportunities my crisis might create. "Mom, you sounded terrible on the phone," Marcus said, taking my hand as we sat in Harrison's conference room. "What's happened now?" I showed him the new fabricated documents, watching his face as he absorbed the supposedly devastating developments in my case. The additional IRS demands, the further investment losses, the immediate payment requirements from Vincent's business partners. Taken together, they painted a picture of complete financial collapse. "This is a disaster," Marcus said, but his tone was more calculating than sympathetic. "How much are we talking about in terms of your remaining liquid assets?" "Less than $5 million, and most of that might not be accessible if the IRS decides to freeze everything pending their investigation." Marcus absorbed this information with visible effort to control his reaction. I could see him recalculating once again, adjusting his expectations and his strategy to account for this dramatically reduced financial landscape. "What does Harrison recommend?" he asked. Harrison, who had been watching this exchange with professional interest, leaned forward and placed a document on the conference table between us. "Actually, Marcus, we were hoping you might be able to help us with a rather unusual solution." Marcus picked up the document, which outlined the supposed trust arrangement that would transfer legal control of my remaining assets to him during the crisis period. As he read, I watched his expression shift from confusion to understanding to what I could only describe as triumph, though he tried to hide it. "This is very complicated. Are you sure this is the best approach?" he finally said. "It's the only approach that gives Elena any chance of preserving her assets," Harrison replied. "But it would require someone she trusts completely to take legal responsibility for managing her affairs during what could be a very difficult period." The setup was perfect. Marcus was being offered exactly what he had been maneuvering to achieve since our reunion, but it was being presented as a burden rather than an opportunity.
If his motivations were genuine, he would be reluctant to accept such responsibility. If his motivations were mercenary, he would find ways to embrace the opportunity while maintaining the appearance of reluctant sacrifice. "I'm honored that you would trust me with something so important," Marcus said, his voice carefully modulated to sound humble and concerned. "But Mom, are you sure you want to put this kind of burden on our relationship? If something goes wrong, if I make a mistake, it could affect our family dynamics for years to come." The performance was masterful. Marcus was expressing exactly the right concerns, raising exactly the right objections, while clearly positioning himself to accept the responsibility he was pretending to be reluctant to assume. "I can't think of anyone I trust more," I said, playing my role in our carefully choreographed deception. "You're my son, and you're the only person who has both the business expertise and the personal investment in my well-being to handle this properly." Marcus looked down at the trust documents again, supposedly weighing the decision carefully, but I could see the calculation in his eyes, the rapid assessment of how this arrangement could serve his long-term goals while allowing him to maintain the facade of reluctant family duty. "If you're sure this is what you want," Marcus said finally, "then I'll do whatever I can to help you protect what's left of Dad's legacy." Vincent's legacy. It was revealing that Marcus framed his acceptance in terms of protecting his father's accomplishments, rather than ensuring my security. Even in this moment of supposed selfless sacrifice, Marcus was thinking about the wealth as Vincent's creation, rather than my inheritance. "Thank you," I said, squeezing his hand with what I hoped looked like grateful relief. "I know this isn't what you expected when you came back to rebuild our relationship." "Family is more important than expectations," Marcus replied. "We'll get through this together, and hopefully we'll come out the other side with our relationship stronger than it's ever been." The trust arrangement would take several days to finalize, giving Marcus time to contemplate his good fortune and plan how he intended to manage my assets once they were under his legal control. Harrison and I would use that time to observe his behavior and document his communications with Richard Blackwood and any other advisors who were part of his broader scheme. But even without additional evidence, I had already seen enough to know that my son viewed this crisis as the opportunity he had been waiting for since learning about Vincent's estate. Marcus hadn't come home to reconnect with his mother. He had come home to claim an inheritance he believed should have been his all along. The only question now was how far he was willing to go to secure access to wealth that would never legitimately belong to him, and how much damage he was willing to do to his relationship with his mother in pursuit of money that represented everything his father had worked to protect me from. By Friday evening, I had my answer, and it was worse than even Harrison had predicted. Friday evening brought revelations that shattered whatever remaining illusions I might have harbored about my son's character. Marcus had spent the day meeting with Richard Blackwood and his associates, supposedly to finalize the trust arrangements that would give him legal control over my assets. What I discovered about those meetings changed everything I thought I knew about the scope of his betrayal. Harrison's investigator had been monitoring Marcus's communications since Wednesday, a precaution we had agreed was necessary given the sophisticated nature of his scheme. The recordings and photographs from those meetings painted a picture of calculated deception that went beyond opportunistic greed. Marcus hadn't just stumbled upon Richard Blackwood's services after learning about my supposed financial crisis. He had been working with Blackwood for months, developing a comprehensive plan to gain access to my inheritance through manufactured emergencies and carefully orchestrated family reconciliation. The entire sequence of events, from his initial contact with me to his eager acceptance of the trust arrangement, had been planned with meticulous attention to detail. The recordings Harrison played for me that evening were devastating in their casual cruelty. Marcus discussing me not as his mother, but as a target whose emotional vulnerabilities could be exploited for financial gain. Blackwood outlining strategies for isolating me from my existing support network while positioning Marcus as my primary advisor and protector. Both men laughing about how easy it had been to manipulate a lonely old widow who was desperate for family connection. "She's been completely isolated since the old man died." Marcus's voice came through the speakers with chilling clarity. "No close friends, no family except me, and she's so grateful to have me back in her life that she'll agree to anything I suggest if I frame it as protecting her interests." "And you're confident she doesn't suspect anything?" Blackwood asked. "She has no idea. Mom always thought Dad was overprotective about money, so she's actually relieved to have someone she trusts helping her make financial decisions. She sees me as the son who finally came home to take care of her." The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, covering details about how they planned to structure the trust to give Marcus maximum access to my assets while maintaining the legal fiction that he was merely a temporary guardian. They discussed offshore accounts, shell corporations, and investment strategies that would make it impossible for me to reclaim control of my wealth once the trust was finalized. Most shocking of all, they had contingency plans for what Blackwood delicately referred to as accelerated inheritance scenarios. If I became suspicious or resistant to their management of my assets, they had legal and financial mechanisms in place that could result in me being declared mentally incompetent and permanently removed from any involvement in my own financial affairs.
The beauty of this approach, Blackwood explained, is that everything appears to be motivated by genuine family concern. Even if she starts asking questions later, Marcus can claim he was just trying to protect her during a financial crisis. And if that doesn't work, we have medical professionals who can testify that the stress of losing her husband and her fortune has affected her mental stability. Medical professionals. They had doctors prepared to declare me mentally unfit if I proved inconvenient to their plans. The scope of the conspiracy was breathtaking, involving not just financial manipulation, but potential fraud, elder abuse, and conspiracy to commit what amounted to financial murder. I sat in Harrison's office listening to my son describe me as a mark to be conned, a lonely old woman whose desperation for family connection made her an easy target for financial predators. Every word of love he had spoken to me, every gesture of concern he had shown me, every moment of apparent reconciliation had been nothing more than performance designed to lower my defenses and gain my trust. "There's more," Harrison said grimly, reaching for another folder. Our investigator traced Marcus's activities over the past year, trying to understand how long he's been planning this. What the investigation revealed was even more disturbing than the recordings. Marcus hadn't contacted me spontaneously after learning about Vincent's estate. He had been monitoring my activities and Vincent's business dealings for over a year before my husband's heart attack. Financial records showed that Marcus had hired private investigators to assess Vincent's wealth and health status. Medical records that should have been confidential had somehow found their way to Marcus months before Vincent's heart attack.
Communication logs revealed that Marcus had been in contact with several of Vincent's business associates, probing for information about estate planning and succession arrangements. Most chilling of all, Marcus had purchased a life insurance policy on Vincent 6 months before my husband's death, a policy that would pay out only if Vincent died of natural causes within 2 years of the policy's inception. The amount of the policy was relatively small, only $50,000, but the timing suggested that Marcus had been anticipating his father's death and preparing to benefit from it financially. "You think he knew Vincent was going to have a heart attack?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "I think Marcus knew your husband had serious cardiac risk factors and was gambling that nature would solve his inheritance problems sooner rather than later," Harrison replied. "The medical records we found in his possession include Vincent's stress test results and cardiologist reports that were supposedly confidential." The implications were staggering. My son hadn't just been planning to steal my inheritance, he had been actively monitoring his father's health and positioning himself to capitalize on Vincent's death whenever it occurred. The grief and shock I had experienced at losing my husband had been opportunities Marcus was prepared to exploit from the moment Vincent died. I thought about all the times during our renewed relationship when Marcus had seemed genuinely moved by memories of his father, all the moments when he had appeared to share my grief over our loss. Every emotion had been calculated. Every display of family feeling had been performance designed to make me trust him with decisions that would ultimately benefit him at my expense. "What about the reconciliation?" I asked. "When did he start planning that?" Harrison consulted another document from his folder. Based on the communications we've uncovered, Marcus began developing the reconciliation strategy about 3 months ago, right after Vincent's will was read and the extent of your inheritance became known. He spent weeks researching your habits, your emotional state, your social connections, looking for the right approach to reestablish contact. The coffee shop where we had met for our reunion hadn't been chosen for its sentimental value. Marcus had selected it because his research had indicated it was a place where I felt comfortable and nostalgic, a setting that would make me more receptive to his overtures. Even the timing of his initial text message had been calculated, sent late at night when I would be feeling most lonely and vulnerable. "He's been manipulating me from the very first contact," I said, the full scope of his deception finally becoming clear. "I'm afraid so," Harrison confirmed. "But, Elena, there's something else you need to know. Something that changes our entire approach to handling this situation." Harrison placed a final document on the table between us, this one bearing official letterhead from the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit. Our investigator discovered that Marcus and Richard Blackwood are currently under federal investigation for elder financial abuse. This isn't the first time they've used this particular scheme to steal from wealthy widows. The FBI had been tracking Blackwood's operation for over 2 years, documenting a pattern of targeting recently widowed women with substantial assets and using various forms of emotional manipulation to gain control of their wealth. Marcus wasn't just my son who had gone wrong. He was part of a criminal enterprise that specialized in exploiting grieving family members. How many other families have they destroyed? I asked. At least 6 that we know of, involving total losses of approximately $40 million. In most cases, the victims didn't realize what was happening until it was too late to recover their assets. I felt sick thinking about other mothers who had been deceived by their own children, other widows who had trusted family members who saw them as nothing more than financial opportunities. The cruelty was almost incomprehensible, not just in its scope, but in its intimate, personal nature. What happens now? I asked. Now we have a choice, Harrison said. We can turn over everything we've discovered to the FBI and let them handle Marcus as part of their larger investigation. Or we can give Marcus enough rope to hang himself while ensuring you're protected from any actual financial harm. The second option intrigued me. After everything Marcus had put me through, after all the emotional manipulation and calculated deception, the idea of watching him destroy himself held considerable appeal. But it would also require me to continue playing the role of vulnerable, confused widow while my son dug himself deeper into criminal liability. What would that involve exactly? Harrison smiled grimly. It would involve letting Marcus proceed with the trust arrangement while making sure every step is documented and recorded. We'd essentially be running our own investigation parallel to the FBI's one, gathering evidence that would ensure not just that Marcus faces consequences for what he's done, but that you have complete documentation of his betrayal. The plan Harrison outlined was elegant in its thoroughness. Rather than simply exposing Marcus's deception, we would allow him to fully commit to his criminal plan while ensuring that I suffered no actual financial harm. The FBI is particularly interested in documenting how these schemes work from the victim's perspective. If you're willing to cooperate with their investigation, your experience could help them build stronger cases against Blackwood's entire operation. The idea of helping other families avoid what I had experienced gave me strength I didn't know I possessed. Marcus had chosen to see me as a weak, lonely old woman who could be easily manipulated. Instead, he was about to discover that he had targeted someone who was prepared to fight back not just for herself, but for every other family member who had been betrayed by people they should have been able to trust. Let's do it, I said. Let's give Marcus exactly what he thinks he wants and see how far he's willing to go. The next phase of our plan required me to play the most challenging role of my life. A grateful mother who was relieved to turn over control of her finances to her loving, trustworthy son. It meant continuing to pretend that I believed his lies, that I trusted his motives, that I saw him as my protector rather than my predator. Monday morning, Marcus arrived at my house with documents from Blackwood's firm and an expression of solemn responsibility that would have been convincing if I hadn't heard the recordings of his real opinions about our relationship. "Mom, I've been thinking about this all weekend," he said, settling into Vincent's favorite chair with an assumption of authority that made my skin crawl. "Taking on responsibility for your finances is a bigger commitment than I initially realized." For a moment, I wondered if Marcus was developing second thoughts about his scheme. Perhaps the magnitude of what he was planning to do to his own mother was finally penetrating whatever conscience he might still possess. "If you're having doubts," I said hopefully, "we could look for other options?" No, Marcus said quickly. "I'm not having doubts about helping you. I'm just realizing that I need to take this responsibility very seriously. Your financial security is going to depend on decisions I make, and I want to make sure I'm prepared to handle that properly." My brief hope that Marcus might be reconsidering his betrayal evaporated. He wasn't developing a conscience. He was simply appreciating the full scope of the opportunity he was about to acquire. "I've prepared some preliminary documents that outline how we'll handle the transition," Marcus continued, pulling papers from his briefcase. "Nothing gets finalized until you're completely comfortable with the arrangements."
The documents were professionally prepared and superficially reasonable, establishing Marcus as the trustee of my assets during what the paperwork described as a temporary crisis management period. But Harrison's analysis had revealed that the language contained subtle clauses that would make it extremely difficult for me to regain control of my wealth once the trust was established. "This looks very thorough," I said, scanning the pages with an expression of confused gratitude. "I have to admit I don't understand all the legal terminology." "That's exactly why you need someone you trust to handle these details for you," Marcus said. "The important thing is that you're protected and that your assets are managed by someone who has your best interests at heart." The irony of that statement was almost overwhelming. Marcus was positioning himself as the person who had my best interests at heart, while actively planning to steal everything Vincent had left me. The casual nature of his deception was perhaps the most painful aspect of the entire experience. "When would this arrangement take effect?" I asked. "As soon as you sign the papers and we get them notarized," Marcus replied. "Blackwood's team is standing by to begin immediate asset protection measures once we have the legal authority to act." Immediate asset protection measures. I knew from the FBI documents that this was code for moving my wealth into accounts and investment structures that would be controlled by Blackwood's operation, with Marcus receiving substantial fees for his role in delivering me as a victim. "I suppose there's no point in delaying," I said, reaching for a pen with hands that I made sure trembled slightly. "If this is what's necessary to protect what's left of Vincent's legacy." Marcus watched me sign the documents with an expression of satisfied accomplishment that he didn't bother to hide. This was the moment he had been working towards since his first contact with me, the culmination of months of planning and manipulation. As far as he knew, he now had legal authority to access and control assets worth millions of dollars. "You've made the right decision, Mom," Marcus said, taking the signed documents and placing them carefully in his briefcase. "I know this is scary, but I promise you won't regret trusting me with this responsibility." I wouldn't regret it, but not for the reasons Marcus imagined. The documents I had just signed were worthless, designed by Harrison to look legitimate while containing fatal flaws that would invalidate them the moment anyone tried to use them. But Marcus didn't know that, which meant he was about to proceed with a criminal conspiracy under the assumption that he had successfully gained control of my inheritance. "What happens next?" I asked. "Next, I coordinate with Blackwood to begin moving your assets into protected structures," Marcus said. "It might take a few weeks to complete the full transition, but once we're done, you'll never have to worry about financial security again." The promise sounded warm and reassuring, but I heard the underlying message clearly. Once Marcus and Blackwood had control of my assets, I would never have to worry about financial security because I wouldn't have any financial independence left to worry about. Over the following days, I watched Marcus throw himself into his new role as my financial guardian with enthusiasm that would have been touching if it hadn't been motivated by greed and betrayal. He spent hours on the phone with Blackwood's team, coordinating what he believed was the transfer of my wealth into accounts he would control. He also began making changes to my daily routine that were supposedly designed to reduce my stress during this difficult transition. He suggested that I stop meeting with Harrison regularly, claiming that involving too many people in my financial affairs would complicate the asset protection process. He recommended that I avoid discussing my situation with friends or neighbors, arguing that privacy was essential for successful crisis management. "You've been isolated for too long, Mom," Marcus said during one of his daily visits. "Being around other people your age might help you process Dad's death and adjust to your new circumstances." The retirement community he recommended was in Florida, over 1,000 miles away from Harrison, from my few remaining friends, from anyone who might ask uncomfortable questions about my sudden decision to turn over control of my finances to my recently estranged son. "I'm not ready to leave Vincent's house," I said, watching Marcus's reaction carefully. "This is where all my memories are." "I understand the sentimentality," Marcus replied, but his tone suggested that sentimentality was a luxury I could no longer afford. "But Mom, you have to think practically about your future. The house is expensive to maintain, and you're going to need to preserve every dollar you have left." There it was again, The practical argument that dismissed my emotional needs in favor of financial considerations that would ultimately benefit him rather than me. Marcus was already planning my exile from my own life, arranging circumstances that would leave me dependent on his generosity while he enjoyed the wealth Vincent had intended to protect me. The recordings from that week captured Marcus's growing confidence in his success and his increasing contempt for my supposed naivety. He bragged to Blackwood about how easy it had been to manipulate me, how grateful I was for his help, how completely I trusted him to manage my affairs in my best interest. She actually thanked me for taking this burden off her shoulders, Marcus told Blackwood during one recorded conversation. It's like she's relieved to have someone else making all the difficult decisions. That's the beauty of targeting family relationships, Blackwood replied.
The victims want to believe their relatives have good intentions, so they ignore warning signs they would never miss with strangers. Plus, once we have her relocated to Florida, she'll be completely dependent on us for information about her financial situation, Marcus added. We can tell her whatever we want about how the investments are performing. They had it all planned out. My assets would disappear into Blackwood's network of shell companies and offshore accounts, while I lived on a modest allowance in a retirement facility hundreds of miles from anyone who might question the arrangements. Marcus would visit occasionally, playing the role of the dutiful son who was managing his mother's declining resources as responsibly as possible. If I asked inconvenient questions about my finances, they had medical professionals prepared to declare me mentally incompetent due to the stress of widowhood and financial loss. If I tried to contact outside attorneys or financial advisors, they had legal mechanisms in place to prevent me from taking any action without Marcus's approval. It was a perfect crime, designed to steal everything Vincent had built while making it appear that loving family members were simply protecting a vulnerable widow from her own poor judgment. The only flaw in their plan was that the vulnerable widow they were targeting had been listening to every word of their conspiracy and documenting every step of their criminal enterprise. By Thursday of that week, Marcus announced that the asset protection process was nearly complete and that we should schedule a meeting to finalize the last details of the trust arrangement. He suggested that we meet at Blackwood's office, where their legal team could walk me through the final paperwork and answer any questions I might have. I think it would be good for you to meet Richard and his associates, Marcus said. They're the people who are going to be helping us manage your assets going forward, and I want you to feel comfortable with the arrangement. The meeting was scheduled for Friday afternoon, and Marcus was clearly excited about what he saw as the culmination of his successful scheme. He had gained control of what he believed was my entire inheritance, positioned himself as my primary caretaker and advisor, and arranged for my eventual relocation to a facility where I would be completely under his influence. What Marcus didn't know was that Friday's meeting would be attended not just by me and Blackwood's team, but by FBI agents who had been documenting their criminal enterprise for years. Harrison had coordinated with federal investigators to ensure that Marcus's final betrayal would be captured in full, providing evidence that would send both him and Blackwood to prison for decades. As I prepared for what I knew would be our final meeting as mother and son, I felt a mixture of sadness and determination that surprised me with its clarity. Marcus had made his choice to see me as a victim rather than a person, a target rather than his mother. Now he was about to discover exactly what kind of woman Vincent Castellano had married, and exactly what happened to people who underestimated the strength that comes from love betrayed and trust destroyed. The game he thought he had been playing was about to end, but not in the way he had planned. Instead of walking away with millions of dollars in stolen assets, Marcus was going to walk into a federal prison cell where he would have years to contemplate the difference between inheriting wealth and stealing it. Friday morning, I stood in Vincent's study, surrounded by the financial documents that had become such an overwhelming part of my life since his death. In a few hours, I would watch my son attempt to complete the theft of everything his father had worked to build, everything Vincent had intended to protect me from losing. But I wouldn't be walking into that meeting as the confused, grateful victim Marcus expected to see.
I would be walking in as Elena Castellano, a woman who had survived 60 years of life's challenges and who refused to be anyone's victim, even if the predator was her own child. The final confrontation was about to begin, and Marcus had no idea that the mother he had been manipulating was about to become his worst nightmare. Friday afternoon arrived with the weight of finality. I dressed carefully in the navy suit Vincent had always admired, choosing jewelry that would remind me of happier times when family meant love rather than betrayal. The drive to Blackwood's office felt surreal, knowing that I was about to watch my son complete his attempted theft of everything his father had worked to build. Marcus was waiting in the lobby when I arrived, his expression radiating confidence and satisfaction. He had no idea that FBI agents were already positioned throughout the building, recording equipment was capturing every word, and federal prosecutors were building a case that would send him to prison for decades. "You look nervous, Mom," Marcus said, taking my arm with what appeared to be gentle concern. "Remember, this is just paperwork. By the end of today, all your financial worries will be over." He was right about that, though not in the way he imagined. Blackwood's conference room was impressive, designed to project authority and success. The man himself was younger than I had expected, probably in his early 40s, with the kind of polished appearance that spoke of expensive suits and careful grooming. He greeted me with practiced warmth, as if he were genuinely concerned about my welfare rather than planning to steal my inheritance. "Mrs. Castellano, it's such a pleasure to finally meet you," Blackwood said, guiding me to a chair at the head of the conference table. "Marcus has told me so much about your situation. I want you to know that our entire team is committed to protecting what remains of your husband's legacy." The performance was flawless, just as it probably had been for the other widows they had victimized. Blackwood's associates nodded sympathetically as he outlined their asset protection strategies, explaining how they would safeguard my remaining wealth from government seizure and creditor claims. "The key is immediate action. Every day we delay gives your creditors and the IRS more opportunity to freeze additional assets." Marcus leaned forward, playing his role as the concerned son perfectly. "Mom, I know this is overwhelming, but these people are experts. They've handled cases much more complex than yours." Complex cases. I wondered how many other families they had destroyed with their expertise, how many other children had been willing to betray their parents for money.
The documents Blackwood presented were sophisticated forgeries, designed to look like legitimate financial instruments while containing hidden clauses that would transfer control of my assets to his operation. He walked me through each page with patience and apparent concern, explaining how every provision was designed to protect my interests. This particular structure ensures that even if the IRS investigation expands, they cannot touch the assets held in trust, Blackwood said, pointing to a section of dense legal language. "Your son will have complete authority to make investment decisions and manage distributions, but everything will be held for your benefit." For my benefit. The lie was so smooth, so convincing, that I almost admired his skill. If I hadn't known the truth about their operation, I might have been grateful for their assistance. "Where do I sign?" I asked, reaching for the pen with hands that I made sure trembled appropriately. Marcus and Blackwood exchanged a look of triumph that they didn't bother to hide. This was the moment they had been working toward, the culmination of months of planning and manipulation. As I signed each document, I could see them mentally calculating the millions of dollars they were about to steal. "Congratulations, Mrs. Castellano," Blackwood said as I finished the last signature. "You've just taken the most important step towards securing your financial future." But as he reached for the signed documents, the conference room door burst open and 3 FBI agents entered with weapons drawn. "Federal agents, nobody move!" The lead agent's voice cut through the room like a blade. "Richard Blackwood and Marcus Castellano, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, elder abuse, and money laundering."
The transformation in both men was instantaneous and devastating. Blackwood's polished confidence crumbled into panic as agents surrounded him, while Marcus turned to stare at me with an expression of shocked betrayal that would have been laughable if it hadn't been so pathetic. "Mom, what's happening?" Marcus asked, his voice high with desperation. "What have you done?" "I've protected myself from thieves, even when those thieves happen to be my own son." Agent Sarah Chen, who had been coordinating the FBI investigation, approached me with professional courtesy. "Mrs. Castellano, are you ready to make your statement?" I stood slowly, looking directly at Marcus as the agents prepared to handcuff him. "I'm ready to tell the truth about everything." The next hour passed in a blur of Miranda rights, evidence collection, and formal statements. Marcus continued to protest his innocence, claiming that he had genuinely been trying to help me protect my assets. But the recordings of his conversations with Blackwood, the documentation of his year-long planning process, and his eager participation in the attempted theft made his protests hollow and desperate. "You set me up," Marcus said as the agents prepared to take him away. "Your own son!" "You set yourself up," I replied. "I just gave you the opportunity to show me who you really are." The federal prosecutors explained that Marcus and Blackwood faced multiple felony charges that could result in 20 to 30 years in prison. The evidence was overwhelming, not just from my case, but from the 6 other families they had victimized. Justice would finally come for the widows who had trusted the wrong people with their grief and their wealth. As the conference room emptied and the last of the FBI agents finished collecting evidence, I found myself alone with Agent Chen and Harrison, who had arrived to ensure all legal aspects of the operation were properly handled. "How do you feel?" Agent Chen asked gently. I considered the question carefully. How did I feel about discovering that my only child was a criminal who had seen my grief as an opportunity? How did I feel about the systematic betrayal of everything I had believed about family and love? "Relieved," I said finally. "For the first time since Vincent died, I know exactly who I can trust." Harrison smiled at that. "Vincent would be proud of you, Elena. He always said you were stronger than you knew." 6 months later, I received a letter from Marcus in federal prison. He had been sentenced to 25 years for his role in the conspiracy, while Blackwood received 30 years as the ringleader of the operation. Marcus's letter was full of apologies and claims that he had never meant to hurt me, that his love for me had always been real despite his criminal actions. I read the letter once, then fed it into Vincent's paper shredder without responding. Some betrayals are too fundamental to forgive, some lies too calculated to excuse. Marcus had made his choice when he decided to see me as a victim rather than his mother. Now he would live with the consequences of that choice for the next 25 years. The house in Westchester feels peaceful now, filled with memories of genuine love rather than manufactured sentiment. I've established a foundation in Vincent's name that helps elderly victims of financial fraud, ensuring that other families might avoid the betrayal I experienced. The work gives my wealth purpose and meaning that goes beyond simple preservation. Sometimes I wonder what my life might have been like if Marcus had genuinely wanted to reconcile, if he had come home seeking forgiveness rather than opportunity. But I've learned not to mourn the son I thought I had. Instead, I celebrate the strength I discovered in protecting myself from the son he actually was. Vincent was right about money revealing people's true character. In Marcus's case, it revealed a character I never want to see again. But in my case, it revealed a woman who refuses to be anyone's victim, even when the predator shares her blood and calls her mother. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.